Thanks to the remarkable work of Karen Ranucci and Julie Crosby, our colleagues and commanders of our ship have steered us into this new printing press facility. It was the floor of an old printing press. The whole building was a graphics arts building. And now we turn that printing press into a new 21st century digital facility. And we look forward to hosting people here when they come to New York in this new classroom for the next generation of independent journalists. And journalists have to work in multimedia formats, even those who've been working for years but perhaps have never done radio, television, as well as print or any other which way, any combination. This is a new era for Democracy Now!, and we welcome you all to the new Democracy Now! But we're going to go to break right now, and we're going to stay in Vancouver to find out what are the rights of people on the border, but also what was this obsession with the Canadian Olympics? What is this crackdown all about? This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. We'll be back in a minute. Fugazi here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez, and it's good to be back home in New York. Juan?
For more on this story and to find out why Canadian authorities are so worried about the 2010 Olympics, we're joined now on the telephone from Vancouver by two guests. Christopher Shaw is a professor of ophthalmology at the University of British Columbia. He's also a leading spokesperson for the No Games 2010 Coalition and 2010 Watch. He is the author of Five Ring Circus, Myths and Realities of the Olympic Games. And David Eby is the executive director of British Columbia Civil Liberties Association.
We welcome you both to Democracy Now! David Eby, let's begin with you. Can you explain this crackdown at the border? How typical is this? And this obsession with, well, first demanding notes and of a talk, and then not being satisfied until I would say that I was speaking about the Olympics.
Well, Amy, unfortunately, it's quite common to see police forces, security forces in Vancouver, in Canada, targeting activists. What's unique about your situation is that you, as far as I know, were not on the record on Canada's 2010 Olympic Games, and the people who have been targeted here at least have spoken out in public at City Hall, in the media, about the Olympic Games. We have had Americans here who are in town, who are activists, who have been arrested and taken to the border because they are associating with anti-Olympic activists here in Canada. And so it's not surprising for me to hear that the Canadian Border Services Agency, which is part of the larger integrated security unit providing security for the Olympics, is interested in Olympic issues. What was surprising was somehow they tied you in with these Olympic issues and this crackdown against activists that's happening here in Vancouver.
And this demand to know thought and speech?
Yeah, it's interesting. We have $1 billion being spent on security here. Protesters and activists have been identified as the #1 security threat to the Olympic Games. And as a result, we actually have police visits happening to people as innocuous as there's a group of Cowichan women, First Nation women here, who knit Cowichan sweaters, and the Bay, which is a department store here, had a very similar design to Cowichan sweater designs, and they said they were going to wear their sweaters along the torch run as a protest, and they were also visited by the police. So you don't really need to be particularly a major security threat to be identified as a threat to these Olympic Games. In fact, basic dissent seems to be identified as a security threat.
And what kind of general preparations is the government making for the Games? I understand there are efforts to remove the homeless from Vancouver. Could you talk about how the general population is being affected?
Yeah, we've been on the defensive basically for the last year, defending rights and freedoms here in Vancouver from Olympic-related initiatives. We've got a new provincial law that allows the police to arrest the homeless who don't report to the nearest homeless shelter when the police issue such a demand to them. We have our police department investing secretly in new equipment that we find out about only accidentally, like LRADs. This is the device that we saw used on protesters in Pittsburgh at the G20 there. $1 billion is being spent on various pieces of equipment and personnel, and we have no idea what's being purchased in terms of rubber bullets, tear gas, that kind of equipment. In addition, we have new city bylaws being passed that restrict the content of people's signs in a large area of the downtown core, dictating that signs either be licensed or the content of the signs be celebratory. And celebratory is actually a defined term in the bylaw. That's a sign that increases the positive feelings or festive spirit around the Olympic Games.
Christopher Shaw, a professor of ophthalmology at the University of British Columbia. You have been a leading spokesperson against the Games. Could you talk to us about why your coalition is opposed and what's been the reaction of the government to your efforts?
Well, the coalition is opposed to the Games across a broad spectrum of issues. The first is the enormous costs. The costs have been really rather extraordinary. They're probably topping $6 billion now. It could go much higher, and we were promised it was going to be much lower. So this is not atypical for Olympic Games. They tend to go much higher, and Chicago is actually really lucky they dodged the bullet, because they would be on the hook for something probably like $15–20 billion when everything was said and done. So we unfortunately didn't dodge the bullet. So vast costs, as David mentioned. There's the impact on the poor and the homeless. There have been concerted efforts to move the homeless along, get them out of the way of the television cameras in the advance of the Games. Massive environmental destruction in various places around Vancouver leading up to the Games. Something like 100,000 trees cut down, much of it old growth, 3.5 megatons of carbon dioxide associated with Games activities, and habitat destruction. Lack of transparency across the board. It's almost impossible to find out what the various levels of government and the organizing committee are actually up to, how they're spending the money, how they're making their decisions. And there's a real lack of democracy. And you're up here in Canada for this show, or at least with David and me being on, and you might call it democracy sometimes. Democracy sometimes works in Canada, and sometimes it doesn't. And the civil liberties really become the final piece of the equation, because civil liberties usually take a hit for Olympic Games. Olympic organizers have become increasingly terrified of protests or anything that would disturb the IOC. So as David mentioned, the city has attempted to pass a major bylaw to the city charter that would allow them to essentially stifle dissent in the city. Unless you're going to celebrate, you're certainly not going to dissent. We seem to have been able to overturn much of that by a lawsuit that David's organization, the BC Civil Liberties Organization, was able to bring in. But we're still facing the so-called Assistance to Shelter Act, the one that can allow homeless to be taken against their will to shelters. And the province has come in with a provincial bill that basically strengthens the city's ability to impose come